Hello and welcome to Byju's. This is the third lecture of Current Affairs Roundup, and in this lecture we'll discuss the current affairs issues from the month of December 2015 and January 2016. If my voice is not audible, please raise your hands. Okay, so the voice is clear. So let's get started with the Current Affairs Roundup, and as usual we'll be covering sources such as The Hindu, Indian Express, Press Information Bureau, Yojana, Science Reporter, and we have added another source in this lecture, and we have added another source in this lecture, and the source is thewire.in. It's a very important website, particularly from the mains point of view, but let's not discount its importance in prelims examination as well. So all these sources we will be covering. We'll be going into detail with some of the topics, and other topics I'll ask you to refer to the notes and we can discuss them one by one. Sometimes we have to go into detail into various topics, because if you look at the past year's question papers, when you look at a question, and if there in a question there are 4 statements, 2 or 3 statements you would understand, you would know whether they are right or wrong. But sometimes one statement is there you're not pretty sure about. So will you skip that question? Or will you answer that but it turns out to be a wrong answer? So that is why superficially we should not cover any topic. We should look into other aspects as well, so that it's not possible for you to understand what sort of questions will be asked. So where we require to dig slightly deeper, we will do that, and where superficial information is required, we'll also do that. So let's get started, and let's take up one issue one by one. Let's take up issue number 1. When Pakistani troops took positions in Kargil in 1999, one of the first things that Indian military sought was GPS data for that region. Why? Because we could know the location and the position of the enemies. But ultimately, when we asked the United States government to provide this GPS data, they denied it. And this episode fueled the need for an indigenous satellite navigation system. And the good thing is, we have it now. We have it in the form of IRNSS. The full form is Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System. This regional navigation satellite system is developed by our space agency ISRO, and now this IRNSS has been renamed as NAVIC. The full form is Navigation with Indian Constellation. So let's talk about this NAVIC, this Indian Regional Navigation Satellite System. It consists of 7 satellites. We'll talk about them in a brief moment from now. The 5th one was launched in December 2015, and now last satellite was launched in April 2016, and now the system is complete. But when we talk about satellite navigation system, SatNav, this satellite navigation system is used world over to accurately track and know the location and positioning of vehicles, persons, shipments, electronic devices, and pretty much anything. But how? Due to receiver and a transmitter. And we'll look into this, how this helps, how this has an impact on our lives. But the most important thing about SatNav is that it is used to trace the location and position of vehicles and individuals. And the most widely used satellite navigation system is GPS, or Global Positioning System. This GPS that is used by our phones and Google Maps. But remember, GPS is a US military controlled system. Russia, on the other hand, has GLONASS, Global Navigational Satellite System. So sometimes these questions become very important when you're asked match the following. So GPS is controlled by US military, Russia has GLONASS. But incidentally, United States and Russia started developing these satellite navigation systems at the same time. But due to financial constraints, GLONASS took a long time to be completed. But ironically today, it's a very important statement for prelims, GLONASS and GPS are compatible with each other. That is, both the nations make use of each other's satellites for their own systems. So what we have looked at as of now, we talked about that India has launched its own satellite system. What was the need? The need was primarily because of the fact that we need our own navigational system so that we are not dependent upon foreign countries. GPS is owned by US military, GLONASS is there for Russia. But what basically is this satellite navigation system? This satellite navigation system is nothing, but it's a collection of satellites. Collection of satellites. These satellites orbit the Earth. And once they are orbiting the Earth, they provide real-time imagery of the Earth. So look at this. When you step out of your house, there are satellites looking down at you from different positions in the sky. Now you have a mobile phone in your hand and you want to reach a certain location. Your mobile phone has a receiver. And this receiver will receive the data transmitted by these satellites. How? In the form of maps. But what is the coverage of these satellite navigational systems? Do they cover the entire world, or do they cover a specific part of the Earth? Now, for any satellite system to have a global coverage, it needs a minimum of 20 satellites. If a satellite navigation system has a global coverage or wants to have a global coverage, it should have a minimum of 20 satellites. GPS has 31 satellites. GLONASS, which is Russian, has 24 satellites. And a very important statement for prelims, only GPS and GLONASS have global coverage. No other navigational system has a global coverage. European Union also plans and is developing its own navigational system, which is titled Galileo. Chinese, on the other hand, they're also developing, and it is in the process, they're developing Beidou. Galileo will have 30 satellites and Beidou will have 35 satellites. So what basically is a satellite navigation system? It's a collection of satellites. These satellites orbit the Earth so that these satellites will provide the exact location of various things that are present on this planet. But whether or not these satellite navigation systems have global coverage, that depends upon the number of satellites that they have. So when we talked about that GPS and GLONASS are the only two satellite systems that have global coverage, Indian satellite system called NAVIC, it is a regional satellite system. It does not have a global coverage. Another very important point for prelims. It does not have a global coverage. It consists of 7 satellites. Out of these 7 satellites, very important thing to remember, 3 satellites are geostationary. Geostationary over Indian Ocean. And 4 other satellites are geosynchronous. Now in geography, you should have read about geostationary. Very briefly, if these 3 satellites are geostationary over Indian Ocean, that is, they will appear to be stationary in the sky over Indian Ocean. They'll appear to be stationary. What do we mean by geosynchronous? That is, these satellites, 4 satellites, they will appear at the same point in the sky at the same time every day. So that means these 7 satellites then will have a coverage not over the entire world, but only over Indian subcontinent. Another important statement from prelims point of view. If GPS has a global coverage, GLONASS has a global coverage, NAVIC has a coverage over Indian subcontinent alone, and if we dig further deeper, you can say up to 1500 kilometers from Indian borders. Fine. These 7 satellites are numbered from 1A to 1G. And as I said earlier, they were launched by our space agency, ISRO. But how will this satellite navigation system help us? That's another very important issue to look at. Yes, we need satellite navigation system, but what sort of services will be provided by this NAVIC? And 2 services will be provided. One type of service will be free for all civilians, and it is called Standard Positioning Service. And this free service will have an accuracy of 20 meters. Another very important statement from prelims point of view. So if this NAVIC system is telling me about the location of a restaurant, when I go to the restaurant, I will find this restaurant within the 20 meters of the location that was provided by the NAVIC. So that means the standard positioning service that we have, it will be free for all civilians and the accuracy will be up to 20 meters. But second one, if we wanted GPS data during the Kargil war, and if we need the data about the location and positioning of the enemies, that means the accuracy has to be slightly better. And the second service will be provided for military, and this second service is called restricted service. And it will have an accuracy up to 10 meters. But how can we use the standard positioning service? I can use GPS or you can use GPS because your phone has a GPS receiver. So if your phone needs a special bit of hardware now, why? Because you want to access this NAVIC data. We are able to use GPS data because our phones are compatible with this. That means if now our phones are to be compatible to use this NAVIC data, we must have receivers for that. And these receivers are currently being manufactured in this country. This is about NAVIC. And this topic, please do not confuse with Gagan. And this was in your January issue of Science Reporter. Now we know we have a regional navigation satellite system that is called NAVIC, but a question may not be asked on NAVIC, but will be asked on Gagan. So what is Gagan basically? As the name suggests, Gagan is GPS aided geo-augmented navigation. This Gagan is also developed by ISRO, but it is developed by ISRO in conjunction with Airports Authority of India. NAVIC is developed by ISRO. Gagan, it will not need the data from our own navigational system, but it will utilize the data coming from GPS, which is a US military controlled system. This Gagan was developed by ISRO, but in conjunction with the airport authorities of India. But why? What was the need for this? Primarily, there were two needs. One, it was used by our commercial airline industry to prevent the congestion in our airports. These details or these locations were utilized so that we can remove the congestion in our airports. So primarily commercial airline industry is using the data that we get from Gagan. And at the same time, very important point from prelims, Gagan is also used by the scientists to study ionosphere. Now, this is a big thing that has happened in India, the launch of Indian Regional Navigation System. Why? Because a system which is run by another country may be switched off in times of crisis. So if it is switched off in times of crisis, what will happen to the security of this country? That will lead to the collapse of certain important services, which we cannot afford. That is why we needed an indigenous satellite navigation system, and luckily, because of the quickness of the response from the government, we have an Indian regional navigation system. And also, have you downloaded the December notes? So if you have downloaded the December notes, please go through GF4. So if you're talking about Indian Regional Navigation System, we discussed that. We also discussed an issue related with that is Gagan. Now there is another system called GF4. This GF4, if you can go through the notes, it is a remote sensing satellite. But it's a remote sensing satellite used by the Chinese. And these G4 stationary satellites are used for disaster prevention and are used for surveillance of various disasters which are geological in nature or which are forest disasters. So basically what we are looking at, an important news came up in the newspapers. The news was that Indian Regional Navigation System has been launched. We talked about what is the impact of that navigational system. Then we linked it with Gagan, which is used by airline industry in this country. And we also talked about GF4 or GAUFEN 4, which is there present in your notes. It is used by the Chinese for disaster prevention and relief. So that was the major issue that we talked about. That's it. Anything else? So there is a question that please explain GF4. If you look at the notes, that is why we have given you the notes even before. So in page number 5, you can look at GF4, which is a geostationary satellite. This satellite will be used by the Chinese once it will be fully developed. This is a remote sensing satellite. So what the satellite will focus on once it is in operation, it will focus on disaster prevention. So it will monitor which are the areas where we may see possible eruption of a disaster. And then relief measures will be undertaken because of the information that we get from GF4. So this is basically an idea about GF4. Since we are talking about Indian satellite system, we need to talk about something similar that the Chinese are doing. Now let's look at another issue. Last year, Rajasthan government banned the practice of Santhara or Salekhana, terming Santhara as suicide. Now what is Santhara? Santhara is basically a Jain practice. A member of Jain community withdraws from food, water, and other worldly bonds, ultimately leading to his death. According to Jain philosophy, this Santhara is the best form of death. That is, best form of death is by starvation, and ultimately it leads to bliss. Rajasthan High Court banned this, terming this as suicide, because suicide is a criminal offense under section 309 of Indian Penal Code. Ironically, last year itself, the Union government recommended that we will delete section 309. But as of now, it has not been deleted. So suicide or attempt to suicide is still a criminal activity. Matter went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court stayed the decision of Rajasthan High Court, but the matter is pending before the Supreme Court. So the question is Santhara suicide? To answer this question, let's go back to Article 21 of Indian Constitution. If you look at Article 21, it talks about right to life. But fundamental question that you should ask, if I have the right to life, do I have the right to die? Clearly, if you have right to life, should you have right to die?